Welcome to the Lost Ways of Knowing podcast. Your host is Matthew Krebs, religious scholar, philosopher, and co-founder of Circle Yoga Shala. The Lost Ways of Knowing teaches a basic history of the Indian traditions that are central to modern yoga. If you're a yoga teacher or practitioner, you must listen for a clear, concise, and provocative engagement with how this history might apply to today's world. The ultimate aim of this podcast is to initiate a dialogue about awakening and overcoming self-deception, leading to deeper intimacy with what is real. Matthew's coming to you from his home, Circle Yoga Shala, which is also a working farm and yoga teacher, yoga therapy training facility.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to episode 3 in our series on meaning and realness. In the last episode, we spent time talking about what is most meaningful to us and the fact that that which is most meaningful to us is that which we experience as the most real. We saw that realness has 4 dimensions: purpose, coherence, significance, and mattering. All of these contribute to the experience of realness, and a serious lack of any of them in one's life is predictive of bad physical, financial, relational, and psychological outcomes. We looked a little bit at how the experience of the real is often coincident with the shattering of illusions. And we saw that though this event of awakening from an illusion always lands us closer to what is true, it's not always a pleasant experience in terms of how we personally encounter it in the moment. But it is what is needed if we are to make our way toward deeper intimacy with the real and therefore toward more meaning in life. And we talked just a little bit about how the practice of yoga stewards the awakening process in such a way that our experience is always taken through these elements of purpose, coherence, significance, and mattering. I think from the last episode, there's something that's really, really important to repeat before we go into the content of this sequence. We made the point last time that we're not primarily thinking things, that at our core, we are this active remembrance and representation of our experience in the spirit of thankful praising or blessing. So rather than conceiving of ourselves as thinking things, we should understand that we're embodied and imaginative and feeling or affective actors, and that we move ritualistically or liturgically in reality in order to discover and know the meaningful and the real. And the bottom line of this rather complex description of what we are is to understand that we're driven ultimately by desire and love, more than we're driven by ideas. So in this episode, I want to drill down deeply into the ways that we come to know the real. And this again comes from the work of Dr. John Vervaeke, the cognitive scientist and philosopher from the University of Toronto. Dr. Vervaeke has outlined what he calls the 4 P's, or the 4 ways that we come to know what is real, and therefore the 4 ways that are involved in discovering and making meaning in life. Each of these begins with a P, so it's a nice coincidence you can memorize them more easily that way. So we come to know what is real and therefore what is meaningful through a kind of sophisticated and hierarchically arranged series of interdependent cognitive patterns. So I'm going to list these in order of their emergence in human development in a certain way, and therefore from the bedrock of the pyramid, so to speak, up to the tip top of the pyramid. So the first way is called participatory knowing. The second way is called procedural knowing. The third way is called perspectival knowing. And the fourth way is called propositional knowing. So these are different, but they're interdependent. And all of them generate forms of true knowledge. And they all combine to engender our sense of what is real and therefore what is meaningful. Each of these ways has a form of memory that is specific to it. And when I named the podcast The Lost Ways of Knowing, these 4 P's really are the inspiration for that title, because it seems that the modern culture that I grew up in, didn't really take into account in my education this hierarchical pattern, or the interdependence of these patterns that form this sort of hierarchy of how we come to know things. And it seemed therefore that when I found Dr. Vervaeke's work, I had discovered this lost treasure in a way that really made it clear and explicit to me. That experience also combined with the fact that as a yoga practitioner for many years, the profundity of the things that I learned from studying the principles of yoga and engaging in the practices continuously was also contextualized in a new way. And I realized that the power of yoga comes from the fact that it sort of intuitively embodies all of these ways of knowing in a very systematic way that allows many different kinds of individuals to interface them in ways that fit our unique constitution. So I came to sort of understand that yoga is this broad spiritual ecology of practices and principles which intuitively make us engage in all of these ways of knowing and the kinds of activities and experiences that help us refine each of these ways. So we're going to go into each one just a little bit and say just a little about how yoga deals with each of them. And I mean, I'll say just a little because the vastness of how yoga embodies these things is beyond the scope of this particular episode. But I would just love to spark your interest as I reveal these things to you from Dr. Vervaeke, so that you can reflect back on your yoga practice and see how they have always already been involved, or if you're interested, in practicing yoga or taking up the practice, you'll have a sense of what you're in for if you find good teachers and belong to a tradition. So the first way is called participatory knowing. And when we know in a participatory way, let's make it simple right off the bat, we belong we know belongingly. Participatory knowing is a kind of profound mutual shaping that occurs between an organism and the environment. And so as organisms interact with a particular environment, they have to shape themselves in order to interface with this environment. And so they're changed through their interaction with the environment, but in a subtle way, the environment is also changed by the interaction of the organism. So when you know in a participatory way, you know in the deepest possible way. And that means you know without knowing that you know. And a great example of this is to think of the way that we learn the most essential things in early childhood. We learn everything in early childhood by immersing ourselves in the things that we want. Things like walking and talking, for instance. So we are immersed in the world, a world of meaning and a world of dynamic interaction long before we understand it conceptually. We're in contact with it. So we don't learn to walk or talk by listening to propositional statements about those things. We learn them by mirroring what we observe and then trying to shape our bodies correctly by molding ourselves literally in response to what we see and to what we feel. So this is a deep primordial way of being rational. And when I am being rational in a participatory way, I'm involved in a dynamic process of contact and response in which adaptation as mutual shaping is continuous. And I end up knowing, as I said earlier, in a belonging way where I am afforded the right fit between me and the world, like a lock and a key. The specific kind of memory that belongs to participatory knowing is the memory of what we would call the self. And so this is really the bedrock, the kind of knowing that forms the fertile field in which my understanding, my feeling of belonging to myself as myself develops. Now, when I think of yoga and participatory knowing, the first thing that comes to mind, obviously, is yoga posture practice and pranayama, or a kind of posture practice that's focused specifically around breathing. If you think about participatory knowing as a mutual shaping, you could just take this panoply of postures that the yoga tradition has given to the world and see each one of them as a world in itself. And so each posture is a specific shape, and we have to move and come into contact with that shape in order to experience the world that it is. And not only do we just sort of ape the shape that we see, our task is to mold ourselves and continually readjust as we move into the vectors that compose the particular shape. And we have to modulate our efforts. And sometimes we have to try a little harder in one area of the body, but sometimes we have to soften simultaneously in another area of the body in order to kind of fit into the posture with my own physical and emotional and psychological uniqueness in a way that's like a key in a lock. And so this process of mutual adaptation is a process whereby effort and the shape of the body, and in particular the breath, is continuously adjusted in response to the feedback that I get. And the classical definition of the asana is Stiram Sukham Asanam, or asana is that which is stable and comfortable. And what that has come to mean for traditional practitioners is that physically and psychologically and emotionally and breath-wise, I'm in the posture in a way where all of those things are flowing freely such that my concentration is deep and insight might arise. So the second P is called procedural knowing. And to make this simple, you could call it the level of knowing that is skillful. This is our ability to do things. And so the skills that we develop in life grow directly from the level that comes before this, which is the participatory level. And so our skills grow out of our direct participation. Conceptual skill is relatively worthless in the real world. And so the rationality of procedural knowing is knowing how to do certain things. I know how to follow a conversation. I know how to catch a ball. I know how to tell jokes, for instance. Each of these things is dependent on, you could say skill acquisition in general is dependent on participation, but it's dependent on participating in a way where I'm paying very high quality attention to the things that I'm doing. And so in order to improve in this procedural area of our knowing, we need to learn to develop very refined attentional skills, very refined concentration skills. So that means we need to pay attention not only to the objects and events that are happening in our experience, we really need to learn how to pay attention to how specifically we're paying attention. And this is called mindfulness or inquiry. The kind of memory that comes with procedural knowing is procedural memory. And this is the ability to execute actions skillfully, and that means without conscious deliberation. And so procedural memory is filled with things that I do very, very well without having to think about them. You could think about walking, for instance. It's just something that we do, and it's very difficult if you step outside of it and try to explain it conceptually, because this kind of knowing is so deep, it's just a part of who we are. Skills are true in a certain way, but they're not true like propositions. Skills are true like rulers or true. They're true like a scope on a rifle is true. That means that the truth of these things lies in the fact that they are very well aligned with the context that we're in. Now, if you think of the way yoga relates to procedural knowing or skill acquisition, and you understand that all matters of skill develop primarily by paying attention to how it is we're paying attention or being mindful, then immediately you can see yoga as deeply involved in this. Because if there is something that yoga is about, it's about how to pay attention to your own attention and how that changes relative to your mood and your interest and your physical motion and your stillness and your awareness of breathing and so on and so forth. And so yoga really is the business of learning to generate high quality attention and sustained concentration over extended periods of time. And the aim of this is knowledge of a certain kind, of course, but it's knowledge that comes from access to higher experiences that transcend the mundane self. And so yoga as knowledge is yoga as intuitive insight, knowledge that comes from absorption, or what is often called samadhi, knowledge that comes from revelation. The third P is called perspectival knowing. And if you wanted to make this one simple, you could say that this is knowing how to be something, or knowing how to play a particular role in a certain context. So perspectival knowing at its root is knowing that I know. Knowing how to be something. You might call it situational knowing. You might call it knowing as particular states of consciousness. This way of being rational is always characterized by knowledge of situational contingencies. And so to have perspective means to be able to recognize that the context that I'm in is changing all the time, and the people in my context are changing, and they are other minds, and they have ideas of their own and feelings of their own and preferences of their own. And so when I have perspective, I'm aware of all these contingencies, and I'm able to play the right role in the situation, and importantly, pick the right skills that will help me do this. Now, generally, when we have problems in life, these problems arise because we often fail to take on new perspectives when we need to. And what generally prevents us from doing this is self-centeredness or egocentrism. So to train the rationality of perspectival knowing, we have to overcome egocentrism, which means taking broader and different perspectives from our own and internalizing those, trying on other headsets, for instance, and beginning to act and perceive the world through these other headsets. So we begin to imitate and internalize the behavior, in the yogic context, for instance, of the sage or the wise one or the guru or the teacher. So we immerse ourselves as best we can in the view of the sage. And because we do that, we see the world in a different way. We see parts of the world that we weren't formerly paying attention to. We see parts of ourselves that we weren't formerly paying attention to. We see the things and feel the things in us that resist these new perspectives because they clash with our egocentrism. And as a result of this, we can discern new patterns. Insights emerge. And in turn, these perspectives of the wise sage can be further and further internalized. And this is an ongoing process that leads in the direction of wisdom and ultimately, in yoga terminology, moksha or liberation. The kind of memory that goes with perspectival knowing is called episodic memory. And that means that as we try on these different perspectives and we begin to be able to play roles in many contingently changing contexts, a story is forming, and there are very important moments or episodes in that story that stick in our memories, and they're significant because they're usually coincident with insight and certain kinds of mistakes and certain kinds of triumphs. So again, this is situational awareness, and specifically situational awareness that leads us to be able to discern what is relevant to know and do and which role to play in any situation. Perspectival knowing, as you can see, is deeply intertwined with our sense of identity or who we are. And if you think about how yoga might understand and embody this process, you can be sure that yoga is deeply intertwined with inquiry into the nature of our true identity and its relationship to awareness or consciousness. So the practice of yoga continuously demands that we inquire into who we are by trying on many different perspectives and by turning our intelligence onto that process as we do it. So it's not just a matter of trying on different perspectives in order to achieve different results. It's trying on different perspectives and examining ourselves doing that process with the most basic level of intelligence that we have. And so we're not just examining the products that result from the things that we do. We are examining the process by which those products are produced. And in that process, we discern more and more and more who we truly are and who we're not. Or you could say we learn to distinguish between what the tradition calls the self and the personality, which is more temporary, more ephemeral, and also the locus of all of our attachments and our ignorance. And so the last P, the tip of the pyramid, you might say, is called propositional knowing. And to make this simple, propositional knowing is knowing that something is the case. And so knowing that is coincident with a kind of knowing that generates what you might call belief. When I know something in a propositional way, I can make statements about what I know or about my belief that are true or false, statements that are factual and contextually correct. To improve at this level of our knowing, we really need to improve our inferential abilities, or our ability to infer from our experience to a particular generalized truth. And in order to improve inferential abilities, we have to overcome our personal biases, which are based on this tendency to be egocentric, which is what we were overcoming at the last level, or the level of developing perspective. Dr. Vervaeke says the practice of active open-mindedness is the practice that helps us learn to find our biases and correct them. And so again, that's turning our attention and the intelligence that's inherent in it onto the processes by which we infer certain things. And through this process, we can learn to correct them. And so propositional knowing, or knowing that something is the case, has a specific kind of memory also, and this is called semantic memory. And this is the memory of concepts and facts and explicit knowledge, you might say. All the things that are true regardless of the situation that I'm in. Yoga certainly is involved in this level of knowing, although in my experience it's much more concerned with participation and skillful development and perspective development and the understanding of identity and overcoming egocentrism. And it's almost like it believes that this level of propositional knowing, or knowing that something is the case, will take care of itself if all of those things are taken care of. But of course, this notion of truth, speaking truthfully, perceiving truthfully, and so on, is deeply intertwined in something in particular called yama, or the observances that Patanjali outlines in the Yoga Sutra, which defines what we call classical yoga. Truth in the yamas is known as satya. And so being in the way of satya, or speaking truthfully, or making this conscious attempt at all times, in all circumstances, to be honest about what we know and what we can say and what we can't. This demands that all of our beliefs, all the things that we think we know, all the facts that we think we know, continually be submitted to this acid test of inquiry. And that in order to do this, we have to manage our speaking and our thinking in a certain way. So my teacher was very insistent that truth is an extremely difficult thing to come to, and especially for people who are as self-reflective and cautious as yoga practitioners. And he said that we might think of satya as honesty, because honesty is something that is actionable even when you don't know the truth of certain things. Being honest often means knowing that you don't know, and this can be the proposition that you speak. This can also be the belief that is true that you have, given any particular circumstance or the content in that circumstance. So let's make a summary. If at our core we are the active remembrance and representation of experience in the spirit of thankful praising or blessing, then we are not primarily thinking things. Rather, we are embodied, imaginative, affective actors, desiring to be in relationship with the meaningful and the real, and therefore we are moving ritualistically or liturgically in reality in order to come into contact with what is real and conform ourselves to it. So we are ultimately creatures that are driven by love. As loving, embodied actors, we come to know that which is real and meaningful in 4 primary ways. The first way is through direct participation and mutual shaping that results from intimate contact with what is real. And this contact, where we continually adjust ourselves and the real continually adjusts itself and we mutually shape one another, this forms the ground or the field for the formation of the self. Through direct participation and contact, we develop procedurally, or we develop skills wherein we hone the ability to execute complex actions by modulating and refining our attention, by continually paying attention in very specific ways so that we understand and immediately correct at the level of bodily participation the feedback that we receive from the real as we remain in contact with it. We come to know then perspectively, wherein we develop a kind of pre-reflective stance in relation to our own knowing. That means we gain the ability to know that we know. And this also means that we begin to sense the presence of others and their minds, which we don't have direct access to, but we're not totally cut off from. In order to do this, we have to overcome our egocentric biases so that we can discern what is relevant to the changing situations that we're part of and pick the right skills and play the correct role in that scenario. Last, we know propositionally, or we know that things are the case. Through active open-mindedness, we continue to overcome specific biases and develop and refine our inferential skills. And this is expressed in the ability to speak and understand true statements that reflect our beliefs, that center around the facts and the concepts that constitute this particular level of knowing. All of these things function together and form what should be known as rationality. Yoga, in the broadest sense, is a spiritual ecology of practices and principles which intuitively and systematically embodies these four ways of knowing. And so it's an incredible offering to the modern world and the creatures who are driven by love and this desire to be in contact with the real and find meaning. It stewards the development of the loving, ritualistic, embodied actor from the ground up through direct participation and skill development and perspectival development, and even to the level of basic truth statement. And most importantly, it puts those in the right order. So I want to thank y'all for listening. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Lost Ways of Knowing podcast. We hope it was informative and also inspiring for you. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcast and leave a review for us so other yoga teachers and practitioners can find us. For in-person opportunities to learn and grow in a community setting, visit circleyogashala.com.